Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are All podcast, where you know what, Brian? As elderly millennials, we just get beaten down by life. We have our bosses attacking us. We have the media attacking us. Everyone's always complaining that millennials are ruining society, ruining our economy. And you know what? I'm just sick of it. I just wish
I'm sick of the lying fake news. I just wish someone would shut him up.
exactly. And you know what? I would just love if we just had one advocate out there, maybe a racially ambiguous man who wears just denim everything, just whips these fucking assholes into shape. You know what?
Oh
That's
boy,
what I
that'd be
really
sweet.
want.
Boy, that would be sweet.
It really would. And speaking of racially ambiguous people who beat up the bad guys, let's get into the 1971 cult classic film, the second film in the Billy Jack series, Billy Jack.
Yes, yes. Oh,
Yes. Now, Brian,
I
this
love
was your choice for this week's episode. Why did you want us to review the second film in the Billy Jack franchise this week?
few reasons. So our last few films, but especially after Drake Across Country, were arguably reactionary, or maybe even right wing. Explicitly, you could maybe interpret them that way. Some of them.
Yes, I would say The Reconciler and Dragged Across Concrete are very reactionary films, but reactionary in different ways, I would say, to a certain extent.
Very different. And then I would say that they're both very contemporary. In fact, so is Team America relatively. And I was thinking of things we could talk about that were kind of antithetical to that. And it also kind of went to a different era. Because, of course, one of the core Mao conceits is that we look at things from different eras and how they've aged and not. And I remembered the Born Losers episode. This had been on the docket for a while, and how stuck in its time this was. And it just seemed like a good time to revisit Laughlin and to revisit the BJU in the context of how much film has changed, both in some ways because of Billy Jack, but in a lot of ways changed in ways that have nothing to do with this film or this series or the people behind it. I kind of wanted to go back and look at what I think is probably, for our means, it's probably the ultimate in like the base lib archetype. Maybe not in the most famous, but in sort of an example of that. I really believe that.
Yes, 100%. And you were talking about how things have changed in the aftermath of the Billy Jack franchise, especially for independent film, because as we'll get into in some of the facts in the interviews, this film and Born Losers, and then to a lesser extent, the latter two Billy Jack films, are pretty much the reason why independent films as a genre are allowed to be successful to this day.
In a way that isn't like art house film. So because of Tom Laughlin and the Billy Jack series, that really is the start of independent cinema that is middlebrow, that isn't grindhouse cinema and isn't art house cinema.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, they're especially Born Losers, I would say, is definitely more. And of course, we'll get into more of our concrete opinions as the review goes on. But I will say, Born Losers is definitely an exploitation film, but it's not like a grimy piece of shit movie that like you would not be able to like show your parents. Like Born Losers is a pretty grimy movie, especially for 1967, but it's a movie that I think parents back then could watch and be like, "Oh, Johnny, this is a cautionary tale. We're going to make you watch this to watch out what to look for when you interact with smelly bikers."
And the Billy Jack films are exploitation. But what Laughlin is exploiting is, I think, and I don't even know if I like the word, I think like he is trying to exploit it. It's more like this sense of this radical changes that are happening in the air. And he's seeing that happening, and he's not seeing it reflected in mainstream American cinema. And he wants to make that. Laughlin actually had been trying to make this movie since I think 1954. I think that's when he wrote the first version of the film that became Billy Jack.
Yes, from what I remember of the facts and trivia of Born Losers, I believe he wrote both Born Losers and Billy Jack in 1954 after a very negative interaction that he saw among white people and Native Americans in his wife's hometown in South Dakota, I believe.
Born Losers was written specifically because he could not get Billy Jack made. He could not prove it to anyone. He could not get it financed. So he specifically tailored Born Losers to sort of take advantage of the biker craze and to introduce Billy Jack.
Fair enough. And I remember he wrote it about a series of rapes in Central California before the movie was made.
Whereas even though that's the introduction of the Billy Jack character, and really the ethos. He's introduced pretty solidly in Born Losers. Doesn't change a whole lot from then on. But this film that's just called Billy Jack is really like the explosion. If there was ever a Billy Jack craze in America, which for a brief time there was, I think it was very short-lived, but that was a real moment. It would be with this film.
Yes, and before we get too into the weeds of our thoughts, let's get into some details here. Now, once again, this movie was released in 1971. It was, as well as Born Losers, rated PG, which is wild to me because there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of nudity, there is a certain amount of very unpleasant dialogue. I'm very surprised this was rated PG, to be honest.
It's like a very adult film. All the films in this, and I don't necessarily mean that in terms of like how explicit they are. It's just like I don't really see I can't imagine a lot of young kids, very young kids wanting to watch this movie. It's a lot of talking about social problems.
Interestingly enough, a lot of the reviews that I saw on Amazon were actually people talking about how they saw this movie when they were like 12 or 13 in the movie theater.
Interesting.
So I think that's very interesting. I think a lot of them were told it was like an action movie with like a social message, and they're like, action movie, yes!
Of course. Which, that's what brings you into the series. We'll get into how much action is in the Billy Jack series.
So next facts here, and this is very much a retread of Born Losers, so I'm going to power through this. This movie was directed by Tom Laughlin under the pseudonym of T.C. Frank, he was also the director of Born Losers. This film was written by Tom Laughlin, who went under the pseudonym for this one of Frank Christina, and Dolores Taylor, Tom Laughlin's wife, who went by the pseudonym of Teresa Christina. This movie was also produced by Tom Laughlin, who also had a different pseudonym of Mary Rose Solti. So Tom Laughlin has 3 different pseudonyms.
I
don't know. I don't understand.
Interesting. Because he seems like such a this is so consummately his vision, and to me that's almost like sort of the draw of it is knowing that it's the vision of one man.
Yeah.
But I guess that was determined at the time.
Well, to be fair, it's the vision of one man and his very, very dutiful helper and ally, Dolores Taylor, his wife too. She was very intimately involved in the Billy Jack franchise too, so I want to give her credit. And Tom Laughlin once again is most known for this film, our previous Billy Jack film that we reviewed, Born Losers, The Trial of Billy Jack, Billy Jack Goes to Washington, and the unfinished film, The Return of Billy Jack. He also starred in another couple other films, including The Master Gunfighter. And Dolores Taylor, Tom Laughlin's wife, is really only known for being involved in the Billy Jack movies. In fact, I think her only credits are the Billy Jack movies. I looked that up, and those were the only credits I could find for her.
Yeah, it seems kind of, in the reading I've done about Laughlin, seems like his initial interest was in social activism and acting from a young age. By the time he got to the point where he could kind of make these films and, was somewhat successful as an actor, kind of seems like he was towards the end of his interest in being a filmmaker. And he mostly did want to use it as a vehicle for activism. Pretty much by this point, if not by this point, then not too long after it.
And we will definitely watch The Trial of Billy Jack at one point, but definitely by The Trial and Billy Jack Goes to Washington, definitely those movies are just pure activism from just what I read about them.
And no, I love those movies. I love this series. This is not a joke. This is not a bit. I'm not being like hyperbolic. I think these are really cool, interesting movies made by a cool guy, but those movies are like fever dreams. They're
very
like
weird.
They are like left-lib manifestos.
And just like Born Losers, this movie is almost equally as long, but this movie is 114 minutes, only a minute longer than Born Losers. Although I will say,
feel as long as Born Losers.
No, I was literally just about to say that. This movie feels significantly breezier than Born Losers. And just to get my opinions out of the way, I like this movie quite a bit more than Born Losers. And I don't even dislike Born Losers, but this movie is this movie's just objectively better. Like, let's be real here.
When you learn that this is the film that Laughlin was spending like 20 years trying to make, and then he suddenly was like, well, I'm going to make a biker movie. When you learn that he made Born Losers as a proof of concept for this movie, it makes so much sense.
Yes, and he was like, oh, I need to get this biker movie. Hey, quick, this 20-year-old, write this movie for me.
And it's also like the time between this and Born Losers, the martial arts craze started to happen, and Laughlin was like, well, that's pretty cool.
And not only that, but like a year after Born Losers came out, the Hays Code was taken down. And he's like, "Oh shit, I could show titties in my movie." No, I'm not going to say that. But yeah, I mean, there is a massive difference in the content of this movie versus Born Losers because, as we've mentioned in the Born Losers episode and as well the Bonnie and Clyde episode, those movies were really, I would say, like proto New Hollywood.
Yeah,
especially Bonnie and Clyde, because those movies were like literally the last movies made when the Hays Code was even mildly still in effect.
Yeah, I mean, I would literally say that Bonnie and Clyde and Born Losers and a few other very successful films are the transitional films from like Hays Code era to like the new Hollywood of the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, and you can very much tell by the content of this movie and Born Losers because they were able to show a lot more in this movie.
Yeah, just in terms of just the violence, and it just, not there's a ton of it, as we'll get into more, but there's violence in this movie, whereas there's mostly the threat of violence in Born Losers.
Yeah, except for the Danny Masterson character, who ironically is actually named Danny in the movie, getting shot in the head and dying in that Kurosawa-ass death. There's very little violence in Born Losers.
Which is maybe somewhat by design. Well, when you look at Laughlin and kind of like the way he looks at, violence and things, I don't know. Maybe not. It might have been a budgetary or logistics thing. I'm not sure.
That's certainly possible. But speaking of being able to show a lot more things, it ended up being very, very lucrative for him because the next facts I have here is it had a budget of $800,000, which is double the budget of his last movie, but was still very much considered a low budget movie back then. And it had a box office of $32.5 million domestically and $98 million worldwide box office, which is insane. I mean, that's like the first Saw level profitable.
Because I know that that doesn't sound quite the same as it did. Also, when you look at if you look at the list of the most highest grossing films and you're of a certain age, that's not going to seem like that much if you're comparing it to say like Spider-Man. And that's a huge deal when this movie comes out for like an independent film, especially unheard of.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, if you made $30 million at the box office, you were in like the top 5 grossing films of like that year in 1971. Yeah. In fact, I think from what I've read, this was the single most profitable independent film till Paranormal Activity.
That's so cool.
That came out, like 45 years later or something? Like, this movie was incredibly successful.
Interesting because I'd be curious to know how much of that happened in the initial few years after its release.
So I actually read it. So actually that'll be one of the facts. So I'm going to hold off on that thought until we get to the fact. But the last detail I have here is this film has a 63% critic score and a 63% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. So equal critics and audience score, which was 3% higher than Born Losers. But there's also a lot more reviews on Rotten Tomatoes for this movie. And then let's get into the trivia right away because that's the thought I want to get back onto. So the first trivia fact I have here is initially this movie wasn't done at the box office, but Tom Laughlin set up further distribution for a re-release in 1973, and that's when it blew up.
He must have sensed something. He must have known that there was something in it. Because a lot of people might just pack it in. You're 2 movies in, and the second one has not really made it. You might think like, oh, maybe Born Losers is it. He must have had a lot of faith in this. And certainly not a lot of his financiers seem to have.
You want to know what I think it was? And this is maybe a guess. But I personally think that the reason that he re-released it was, even though 1971, and this movie, and Tom Laughlin's, I would say his overarching activism, especially in pop culture, was his activism for Native American rights.
Yeah.
I would say overall. And in 1971, American Indian civil rights were definitely formulating as a coherent social movement, but it wasn't quite there yet. But by 1973, it had gone in fucking full swing. You had, stuff
That's
like
the year of Brando refusing to go to the Oscars.
Yep. And then Sashi Littlefeather read off his speech. I believe that was the same year as the Alcatraz occupation. I also believe that was around the time that Leonard Peltier got strung up by the FBI.
Oh, I think you're right. That's a good point.
So I think he had an idea, kind of like Born Losers, where he was just a few years too early for something, but this time he was allowed to be able to really wait and just, strike when the coals are hot for this movie you already had, then redistribute it when, it was a little bit hotter. So I think, and I'm not saying that from like a cynical perspective, I think that he was like, oh shit, I can actually like get more activism out there, in like an altruistic way. I genuinely believe that.
There's an audience for this thing that I was talking about that wasn't quite formulated a couple of years ago.
Yes, so that is my best guess on why it became much more successful a couple of years later.
No, that makes total sense.
The next trivia fact I have here is the Hapkido fights were choreographed by Hapkido master Bong Soo-han, who was also Tom Laughlin's body double in the fight scenes. And you can kind of tell by some of the shots, especially in the back, where it's clearly a much different body type than Tom Laughlin.
That's not Tom. That's not Tom.
Next little minor fact I have here is, and I think you had mentioned this when you asked us to do the Born Losers episode, but I don't remember. But this was supposedly one of Elvis Presley's favorite films.
Yes. Supposedly. Which I can totally, for some reason that just fits into my image of Elvis, like that Billy Jack, that's a real man. You can just see it.
Well, Brian, what I think it is, Game recognizes Game, and he's like, you know what?
Yeah.
I've appropriated Black culture my entire professional career.
Yeah.
Here's a guy who's really good at appropriating Native American culture. I respect you.
So here's the thing. You're kind of joking, but I think part of it is Billy Jack's a guy that Elvis would think is cool. That's the same type of guy, which is like a white guy who kind of adopts the swagger of a non-white person, which is what all friends are. Like that's what you've done. People have done to white people have done to cool forever,
Oh no, 100%. Yeah. I'm definitely joking a little bit, but there is definitely a little bit of truth in there.
So that's interesting because one of the things I think, don't hold this against Tom Laughlin or the Billy Jack series, please, listeners or Taylor. This is the proto Steven Seagal. Billy Jack is the proto Steven Seagal. And that is not Billy Jack's fault. That's not an indictment of Tom Laughlin. They are coming from different places on every level.
Yes, 100%. And we do need to reiterate to the audience at home, Tom Laughlin's politics are 1 trillion times better than Steven Seagal's politics.
Look, I got no problem with it. Like Laughlin's like a big lib, but he's also not like an actual politician. He's like an entertainer trying to raise awareness to things. So he's probably said some doofy shit. But it's also like, what's he really going to do? How is his influence ever going to affect anyone in a way that was harmful? Like, probably not. So I'm fine with it,
For sure.
But I think when you look at his whole deal, which is that he pretends to be every type of non-white group. He makes blues music. He spends a lot of time in Jamaica. Sometimes he plays a Mexican character. Sometimes he plays a Native American character. And he has this sort of vague lip service to like spirituality and social justice in his movies, which is totally fake and put on and an aesthetic choice because he's a psycho with no personality. Yeah. That's all Billy Jack. He saw Billy Jack when he was like, a kid or a young man or whatever. And he was like, oh, that's cool. But he didn't have that feeling that Laughlin had. And I say this as a guy who's seen a lot of Steven Seagal and even enjoyed some of it.
Next fact I have here is the title of the song One Tin Soldier, recorded by the band Coven, was not written specifically for the film, which deemed the song ineligible at Academy Award time. Now, Coven are a band who I would argue very, very influential. One of the first metal bands. Some people have even argued that Black Sabbath directly ripped them off, but, that's not here or there. I won't personally get into that because I'm not knowledgeable enough. But one thing I will say about Coven, this needs to be said. Their vocalist, Jinx Dawson, is in the pantheon of Jane Fonda and Susan Sarandon as the hottest elderly woman of all time. She has to be up there. Have you seen Jinx Dawson? She's like in her 70s and she looks phenomenal. Like there has to be some like fucking witchcraft shit going on with her.
Well, she wasn't Coven, so
That's very true, exactly. I was curious about her because, of course, I forgot that One Tin Soldier was in this movie. And I'm like, oh, yeah, Coven. And I looked her up. She's on Instagram. And I can tell you, she blows a lot of 20, 30-year-old girls on Instagram out of the fucking water. Very, very lovely lady. If you're listening to this episode, please DM me on Twitter. I'm at Carlos Chantor. You live in Chicago. I can make the drive. Please, Miss Dawson, just give me a chance. Just give me a chance.
Jinx Dawson.
Yeah.
Yeah, One Tin Soldier, great song. Kind of crazy that it wasn't written for this movie in some ways.
Yeah, it really is. Although you watch the music video, and the music video looks like it would be more of like almost like a skit on like a Monty Python. It looks kind of like Monty Python animation, which is very interesting.
I need to watch it. That sounds badass. It's a great song. It doesn't sound like anything else really that Kevin did, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I mean Jinx Dawson is just a phenomenal vocalist. Just I want that to be clear. She does phenomenal on that song.
Did get screwed out of an Oscar for Best Dressed Song because it wasn't an original for the film. You wouldn't guess that it's by a band like Kevin. If you just heard it, you would guess that, I don't know, like a Partridge Family with edgier lyrics.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it, I think. All right, next fact I have here is, I believe this is one I mentioned to you earlier, but Quentin Tarantino and Brad Pitt watched this movie at Tarantino's house to prepare for filming of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. They felt Tom Laughlin could have played the role of Cliff himself.
That's so awesome. I didn't know that, but as soon as you told me that when we were messaging about this, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. That's cool.
And then the next Hollywood fact I have here is also very interesting because I would have never guessed this in a million years, but it is said that Marlon Brando considered Dolores Taylor's post-rape scene, spoilers ahead, to be one of the greatest scenes of acting he ever saw at any time. John Travolta also said in several interviews that the same scene was a huge contributor to why he chose to be an actor.
It's intense.
It is very intense. And also, I want to compare that to Born Losers, which we both said was a very poor portrayal of a post-rape scene. But I think this one's far better. It is far better. Just like
it's like night and day. And it is like a great scene, and not the least of which to her portrayal. Like it could still be very bad without an actor that is willing to go to that place and take it as seriously as she does. But I think if you're coming to this movie and you're kind of looking at like it's a 70s like hippy dippy action movie, and then there's a rape victim, you might be like kind of shocked at how affecting the scene is.
100%. Yeah, it was a hard scene for me to watch. Whereas in Born Losers, it's a hard scene for me to watch because I'm like, oh god, this is very, very bad.
That's bad news. Just women just screaming and talking in baby voices.
You know, I will say, I remember talking to you before we recorded, and just how much as a director and filmmaker that he like developed into. Like he really did evolve into a much better filmmaker just 4 years later. That's pretty impressive.
Well, I think I don't know this, but I wonder if he was able to look back because Born Losers was not his first feature. I don't.
No, he was an actor in Hollywood as I believe as early as like 1954, I believe. So he'd been in Hollywood for quite a while.
Yeah, it's quite a young man. But I feel like my guess is that he was able to look back at that movie, see the things that worked with it, and really reach for the things that didn't. Because there's a pretty long gap between this and Born Losers. At least when you consider how fast sequels come out nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fuck. I mean, and I know this isn't quite the level of filmmaking, but like Marvel movies have sequels every like 6 months. Like it's just like.
Well, because if they lose the momentum, people will forget about them because everyone that watches those movies has the attention span of a fucking ant.
Yeah. All right, and the last fact I have here is Dolores Taylor was nominated for a Golden Globe Award as the most promising newcomer in 1972, which I thought was really cool as well because she is also very, very good in this movie.
It's great in it. She's just acting chops wise. She's the best. I mean, just if you're looking at performing, she is very good in it. She's like a real pro in this movie that doesn't have a lot of those on screen.
All right, let's get into the synopsis here. So the film begins with an opening narration where the narrator, who we later learn is the character Jean, played by, once again, the actress Dolores Taylor, describes how her and Billy Jack couldn't be any more different, and describing ominously and briefly the final outcome of this film. It's very much a foreshadowing of the tragedy that is to come. We then meet Sheriff Cole, played by the actor Clark Howard, and he explains to his deputy, Kenneth Tobey, his name is Deputy Mike, that they have found the deputy's daughter, who is living in San Francisco, in Haight-Ashbury, so we assume that she's basically a hippie, and they are sending her back to Phoenix, Arizona, which I believe this movie was set in Arizona, if I'm not mistaken. And also another funny line dialogue that I didn't realize was going to come so in handy very quickly, but they also talk about dog food Mustang meat prices. So basically they're like, hey, what's the pound for dog food these days from a horse? And they say like 6 cents a pound. Is like, all right, let's go. And I'm like, what the fuck was that? But then that becomes immediately relevant. We then get the opening credits where 110 Soldier, the subtitle of the song is The Legend of Billy Jack by Coven plays. And it's played over like aerial shot of like fucking horses going through the countryside. It's a very, very good opening credit sequence.
Well, Billy Jack's in touch with nature. He runs it, but he also respects it.
So let's talk about the relevance of the Mustang scene. In the post-opening credit scene, we have a bunch of poachers, including Stuart Posner, played by the actor Bert Freed, and Bernard Posner, played by the actor David Roya, about to kill Mustangs for their meat illegally on native land when Billy Jack himself, once again played by Tom Laughlin, shows up to save the day. And it's really interesting because he goes up to these guys like, you know you're on native land, right? And he's like, you know, we just kind of like walked along it. We didn't realize it was. And it's like, all right, sure.
Pretty realistic scene on how that'd probably go down, except Billy would probably, not walk away from that in real life.
You know, I don't know, Brian. I would say that white people encroaching on native land to poach, that's not very realistic. I don't think that's ever happened.
Yeah, and especially not around here.
Yeah.
In the plains. This movie is being a little woke.
Yeah.
Take it down a notch,
I am legitimately surprised because I looked up a lot of content for Billy Jack and the franchise. Nobody called this movie outside of... Okay, well, never mind. I will say, nobody specifically used the word woke, which I was very surprised.
Do you know why? I spent a lot of time thinking about this because, again, I thought about... We've talked about how even though this was like a cultural phenomenon that doesn't have much online presence because it's so aggressively boomer, all the people watching this movie, if they're white people and they're of that age, are probably like people that were like anti-authoritarian and maybe even had kind of good politics and then grew up into like these weird reactionaries. And then they separate that. They like, if you met anyone like this, they like, they kind of categorize things. So they're like, well, that's what it was. And it's like that now. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the reviews because some of the reviews are very interesting because they do kind of mention a little bit of that, but they don't use the word woke, which I was very surprised by, I will say.
It's just because it's old.
We then get further narration from Gene once again that explains Billy Jack's mysterious background, which is pretty similar to Born Losers. So in the first movie, once again, if you didn't listen to the Born Losers episode, which I would really recommend because it's our second most viewed video on the YouTube channel, so please watch it.
Yeah, but I'm very proud of that because there really isn't a lot of good information about these films or analysis of them.
No, 100%. But in that movie, they describe Billy Jack as a former Green Beret Vietnam veteran who is, and this is what the film says, I'm not calling him this, they call him a half-breed because he's half Native American and half white. Although in real life, as we went over many, many times, he is a white guy from the north side of Milwaukee. He is objectively very, very, very white in real life.
He is about the same as Taylor and I, genetically and culturally. And...
Yes. I used to work at a job where I literally drove past his high school every day for work. He is a very white man. Yeah. But that's neither here nor there. But after his veteran service, he is committed to the idea of basically just being a mysterious wanderer who just helps people in need when necessary, but otherwise just does not get involved in conflict as much as he can avoid it. But unfortunately, conflict always finds him. Deputy Mike's daughter, Barbara, played by the actress Julie Webb, comes back home, and in a rage at finding out Barbara is pregnant by a random man, Deputy Mike beats her into unconsciousness, and I'm not entirely sure if she ran away or he leaves her along a bank of a river. What did he like?
I think she runs away.
Okay, that's okay. Because like at first I was like, I thought he abandoned her on like the side of a river, but then it's like, spoilers for the rest of the plot, but they're basically in search for Barbara the whole time. So I'm like, wait, if he leaves her on the side of the why? But okay, but she runs away.
I think she ran off, yeah.
Where Billy Jack finds her and brings her to the hospital. Billy Jack gives her refuge at an alternative multiracial countercultural school ran by Gene, which I think was partially based off of Tom Laughlin's real Montessori school, and also Prescott College in Arizona, which apparently was a direct influence on the school for this movie.
Some of this stuff, I mean, the whole concept, this film centers around this school. Billy Jack is kind of a guardian angel for the school, which, because it's a progressive school, an alternative school, run by Native Americans and it's multiracial and things, it's kind of constantly under threat by the police and the city authorities. And when Billy Jack is back in town, they're able to rescue him knowing that the city officials will be a little bit more lenient because they're afraid of Billy Jack because he's a crazy half-breed.
And then after that, we get a couple other scenes, establishing scenes of the school kids playing music and doing arts and crafts. Honestly, not very important scenes, so I'm just going to move on. But the next important scene here is these school kids and Billy Jack go downtown of this small town where they face general harassment and segregation from the local businesses and town folk. And part of it is just due to the fact that they're like alternative countercultural, but also part of it is just explicitly from racism, because a lot of the students that get shit on are either in real life Native American or in the movie are coded to be Native American.
And I want to say, like, in Laughlin's defense, we got into this a little bit in one movies. There is not a great amount of like historical accuracy to like Native culture and thing, but there is an effort paid to it. I don't want to say that it makes it okay to do that, but I do believe that his intent wasn't to like adopt someone else's culture. I think he probably viewed it as that he was playing a character, which I know is it's a shitty excuse that people say all the time for appropriative performances. I don't love all of that, obviously, but I think taken in the context of the time, it's a little different than if someone were to do it now.
No, 100%.
Of course, I'm very white, so if anyone feels differently, please let me know.
At the ice cream parlor, several of the students are refused service by the owner and are harassed by Bernard Posner. And they're harassed by him, by the ice cream owner not willing to serve them. And then Bernard comes in there and he's like, hey, you know what? You don't want to serve them because they're not white. Well, let me make them white. So he takes flour and throws it in the kid's face, making them white. Just general racist asshole bullshit.
This is, as far as a great scene where you're set up to like hate a guy and watching this come up, this is incredibly satisfying. He's such a fucking piece of shit.
Yeah. And speaking of comeuppance, Billy Jack comes to the ice cream parlor and dispatches Bernard and several of his goons outside of the parlor as well as inside the parlor and in the town square after they stole a part from Billy Jack's truck. And this is probably the most famous scene from the entire movie. The goons and Stuart Posner, who is Bernard Posner's dad, get the better of him after an amazing Hapkido action scene, which is genuinely an awesome scene. I was cheering the whole time.
It's so cool. Also, just want to put out, Billy Jack has learned Hapkido since Born Losers. Yeah.
But before they can finish him off, Sheriff Cole, who we mentioned earlier is the sheriff of this movie, the superior of Deputy Mike, stops the fight. Now, I do want to talk about the Hapkido fight a little bit because it starts off with Billy Jack just being like, you know what, Stuart? I'm going to take this right foot. I'm going to put it right up to your face. And he's like, yeah, really? He's like, yeah. And then the next thing you see is just a slow-mo of him like roundhouse kicking him and then like a bunch of other guys. It's so good. If the audience at home want to know what we're talking about, because it might be a little out there, just look up on YouTube, Billy Jack, like a kung fu fight, Billy Jack, whatever. You will find it. And it is fantastic. And frankly, before we get too much deeper into the plot, if there were like a couple more scenes of like that in this movie, I would say it was like one of my favorite movies we reviewed for the plot.
Why aren't there? Because there's all this shit, and we'll get to it. There's all this shit that's showcasing his Laughlin supporting cast. We already talked about the kids doing craft and singing folk songs at the school. Later on, there's like extended improv, and I think that's genuinely in part because Laughlin wanted to show off, the talents of his crew around him and give other people a showcase. But those two scenes both could have just been fucking Hapkido fights.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. If this movie, instead of the filler scenes, which we will get into later on, if it was just like half filler of those scenes and half Hapkido, this movie would be fucking a 10 out of 10 for me. Like, it just would.
It's Hapkido and then it's like some social injustice psychodrama thing. And it just alternates between the two and culminates in like a Hapkido justice fight. Just perfect.
So after that epic fight scene, Sheriff Cole, Deputy Mike, and the Posners go to the school to look for Billy Jack after he has seemingly gone into hiding after the fight. Jean claims to not know where he is and refuses to help them in their search for Billy Jack. And now she doesn't say, I will not help you, but she does not seem very reticent to help them in their search for Billy Jack. In the aftermath of the town brawl, The town council plans to ban the students from entering the town except for a few hours on Saturdays. After some very heated debates, the town council agree to go to the school to check it out before they make their ultimate decision. Now, I will say, these scenes at the town council are hilarious because they're literally what a town council like meeting is like today. It's hilarious.
Yeah. Chaos, it's people bickering, it's, cheap jabs at each other.
There's some Godwin's Law. They talk about Hitler. Like, it's just like...
I want to say that, like, the listener, you probably think that when we talk about color themes, we're talking about this. I don't think so. This is actually pretty important to the spirit of Billy Jack, of these town councils. People debating social justice in a public forum is essential to the Billy Jack franchise. And that is part of what you're here for. I need to make that clear. It sounds like I'm joking. I'm not. You want to see these people half improvising and philosophizing and arguing with stodgy old authority figures and calling them pedophiles, which of course happens in this scene. That is part of the action of the Billy Jack series. And one of my core observations about Tom Laughlin is that he is making action films, but the action he's most interested in is not physical combat. It's like this sparring of ideas. He's interested in, this sounds so stupid, but it's so perfect because, again, we talk about the base glib. And he is interested in winning in the marketplace of ideas publicly. That is what he sees as the most interesting conflict. And it does show me that it's fun to watch people argue with Billy Jack movies because you know that that's how Tom Laughlin thinks things get done. It's by being the smartest, funniest person in an argument.
He's always been the person who believes in, the marketplace of ideas. He believes in freedom of speech, and he believes in the American dream. That is Tom Laughlin to the core.
And he believes that if you are, and we can get into, I don't want how much I believe in those things. I think that's possible. But they're admirable things to believe in the way that he does. It's nice to watch a movie like that, to me at least, even though not entirely convinced that that's the way that democracy functions, But I don't mind seeing it in a movie like this once in a while,
No, 100%. And then the next scene, this is one I really wanted to highlight. We then get a scene where Billy Jack gets inducted into a ritualistic snake bite ceremony. He survives after a very tense scene with him and the rattlesnake where he gets bitten several times. And then the one scene I really wanted to highlight here, because it's just fucking hilarious. Billy Jack then lectures a bunch of Native American people respectfully, because in this film he's supposed to be like a wizened person who understands the tribal traditions, but he's trying to lecture a bunch of natives about their history and traditions. But here's the problem. Billy Jack gets a lot of who I assume are genuinely Native American people. They look very Native American. And he's in the middle, the whitest looking motherfucker out of this group by far, talking to them about their own traditions, wearing their own traditional outfits. It's hilarious to watch this in 2023. Because if this movie was made now, this would get roasted so fucking hard.
Yeah, getting back to that, I feel like it is different. And again, if I'm wrong, please, anyone listening, tell me. Should we have any Native listeners? But I do feel like, he tried to showcase, real Native American activists who he was friends with and worked pretty closely with in film. He tried to involve them, and it does seem like he involved them in these discussions on set. And I think his thought process was that Billy Jack should be the one saying it, not because Tom Laughlin is the expert, but because Billy Jack, the Native American hero of the movie. Does that make sense? Does that track? I realize it's a flimsy argument.
So obviously this would not fly very well in our modern era. But I think, in all honesty, and maybe I'm wrong, and if there's anybody wants to correct me in the comments section of this YouTube video when it goes up, please feel free to. I take constructive criticism very well, especially when it comes to the content, we make. But I think part of it was, and I do believe Tom Laughlin was the good vehicle for this, because Tom Laughlin is, as we talked about, Brad Pitt used him as part of the inspiration for the fucking Quentin Tarantino movie that came out a couple years ago. He is a square-jawed, handsome, traditionally, he is a white American. And if you're going to get a lot of people to listen to your message in 1971, they're not going to listen to random Native American person in a movie. They're going to listen to this square-jawed, Midwestern, just staunchly average American man tell you this. They just are. And as shitty as that is, that's why people like Tom Laughlin help pave the way for actual Native American people to be able to talk about their issues genuinely and in their proper context now, I think.
Have you seen the documentary Real Engine?
I did. I have not seen it in quite a long time, but I do remember watching it.
There's a very brief section where a couple filmmakers, this is all actual Native American filmmakers, it's a documentary about portrayals of Native American film and Native people working in American film. It's very good. There's a very short little bit where they talk about Tom Laughlin and Billy Jack. At least these two people that are portrayed, and this is a movie made by and for Native American filmmakers. To say that at the time growing up, nobody that they knew had an issue with the Billy Jack character. I don't mean to play a like I have black friends card. Did I know that might be how it sounds? That at least is how that documentary, which is a pretty politically radical documentary, posits it. Is that at the time I see they sort of indicate that maybe people were just happy to see like these positive portrayals and have their own like action hero. So, and it got me thinking about John Trudell, who is a Native American poet and activist, and this thing that he said a lot about white people kind of being, quote unquote, pretendians, and how he believes that there's this deep kind of primordial urge by people who are colonists to go back and they don't know what their roots are because it's so far away, whatever Europeans started as before they were colonial, medieval Europe or whatever. So they adopt their cultures. And I was thinking about that while I was watching Laughlin in this, because it doesn't seem, again, I wouldn't say it's not like, quote unquote, red face like you would typically expect. He's not doing like sort of a mockery of the culture. He's trying to represent it as best he can. And it is awkward and it's weird, but I'm not sure if I'd draw the line at like, I mean, it would be bad now. And I don't think it was good then. But it seems like for a long time, it was generally just considered a positive portrayal. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, and I don't think it would be necessarily if these movies were made now. But I think it's a complicated question that hangs over Laughlin's career and over Billy Jack.
No, 100%. Yeah. I think, yeah, especially as I mentioned earlier, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong. So once again, correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section if you watch this video. But like I said, if you wanted these messages to get across in 1971, if a white guy has to say it, a white guy has to say it in 1971. That's just how it was. Like, I mean, like, and he did it, I would say, as respectfully as you could, I would say.
I think so. And again, we might be wrong with that. But you know what? Also, when it comes to this podcast, you know what? If a couple white guys have to tell you what movies are good and what ones are bad, maybe that's just the way it is.
Yeah, once again, as we always say, let these old-ass piece of shit millennials tell you the truth about movies.
Look, I have been alive since 1991. I've been around the block a time or two. And I can tell you, I know about representation in films.
Yeah.
You ever heard of a little movie called Clueless?
Oh, shit. But yeah, let's get back to the plot here. So after that, we get some scenes where the school are doing like various stage play things. They're doing like guerrilla acting in public. They're trying
performing for the city council.
Yeah, they're doing a stage production for the city council to show that they're not degenerates, essentially. And there's a lot of those scenes. A lot of them aren't super important, but some of them are enjoyable.
I truly believe Laughlin was like, we're going to have these talented, bright kids that are in my cast and we'll do a little bit of improv comedy. And I think he was really thinking, it's your time to shine. And it's some of the worst shit in the movie.
Yeah, it's not good.
It's fine, but
they are very much filler scenes. It is like one of those things where like the drummer is like, hey, can I write a song? It's like, yeah, sure. Fuck, we'll put it on the album.
And you know what could have happened? City council comes in, Billy Jack does some Aikido for them, and they're like, wow, that's a real practical skill you're teaching these kids. And you're really mixing cultures. It's really showing the melting pot of America with your half-breed Aikido. But instead they did this extended improvised play. They did like a trust exercise where the city council member pretends to be the kid and the kid pretends to be the city council member so they can understand each other. Yeah. And it takes up like fucking 40 minutes of the film.
Yeah. In a much less lighthearted scene, The next scene has Bernard threatening a student at the school with sexual assault if she does not give up information on where Barbara is. Now, this is one of the hardest scenes to watch in the movie because he's putting a knife up to this girl and basically threatening to murder her if she doesn't take off her clothes for him. I won't expound upon that, but it's pretty hard to watch.
So
Billy,
Tom Laughlin is really you know those guys on Facebook that respond to any article about like an abuser or a pedophile or anything like that, and they go, "I would kick these guys ass. I would cut his nips off, shove him down his throat." Tom Laughlin made a whole film franchise around being that guy.
You know who also made a film franchise about that kind of guy? Was Tom Six, the director of Human Centipede.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, the director of Human Centipede based the idea off the Human Centipede off of what he would like to do to pedophiles.
That's so fucking funny.
That's
I agree. He's not wrong, but that's so funny.
And that's legit. That's not a joke. That's what he said in interviews.
Oh wait, do you think Billy Jack could fight a human centipede? Like the whole human centipede. The second sequence. Is that what it is? The one that's 12 people?
Yeah, I think so. Oh my god, we're never gonna review the Human Centipede movies, but Human Centipede 2 and 3 are fucking batshit insane.
I've never watched 2 and 3, but I want to because they sound awful. But okay, but hey, hear me out. Billy Jack has 2 races inside of him, but the Human Centipede has 4 different races that make it up. So you get them all fighting together. There's all kinds of energies floating around there. I'm getting into like pseudo mystical race science.
Yeah.
Don't part. Anyways, I think Tom Laughlin would have made. Oh, do you know about the abandoned Billy Jack 5th film? We won't talk about it.
That's the return, right?
Yes, yeah. We'll maybe get into that once we get farther in the series. But that sounds wild. The Human Centipede in it was supposed to be in it.
But Billy Jack and Jean then arrive to rescue the girl just in time, and Billy Jack, in retaliation, makes Bernard drive his new car into a lake. Now, this is also an interesting scene because it's basically like, well, I could fuck you up, or I could make you destroy your fancy new car. What do you choose? And of course, he chooses the fancy new car that his dad bought him. Now, I will say, I did not expound upon Stuart and Bernard in this movie. So Bernard is Stuart's son, and Stuart Posner is like the political boss of this county. So I would assume he's like some county commissioner or something like that. So he basically controls the county's finances. He's a real shithead. That's the best way I can I mean, they're both shitheads. And then this is the scene that we mentioned earlier that Marlon Brando and John Travolta were very inspired by. And in retaliation to that scene where, Bernard is forced to drive his car into the lake, Bernard and his friend kidnap and rape Jean. Now, this is a scene that is very hard to watch. I think you can agree with that, Brian.
Oh yeah, no, this is in the middle of the tone of the Billy Jack series is very weird, and sometimes you go from an extended improv comedy scene to a very serious rape scene.
So it is. I won't expound upon it, but she is sexually assaulted by both Bernard and his friend. And during that scene as well, we also see that for some reason they allow Barbara, who is pregnant, to ride a horse, and she falls off of it and she loses the baby. Now, I understand not everybody knows about biology. Why the fuck would you allow a woman who is pregnant to ride a horse? That is insane.
I mean, that's about the worst thing. Yeah, even if she didn't fall off the horse, and not great for the baby,
Just absolutely insane. Like, I'm sorry, like, it's just, no. You do not allow a woman to ride a horse while she is pregnant. That is not cool, guys. That is not fucking cool. And
that's also cool. I gotta come and say it. Neither the riding the horse while she's pregnant, nor the other lady getting ard are very cool.
The Posners and Detective Mike get confirmation that Barbara is at the school after, once again, we find out. And that's why I think that scene's very contrived, because it leads to the Posners and Detective Mike getting confirmation that Barbara's at the school, because the physician who informs them that the baby was unfortunately not allowed, was miscarried, essentially, is at the barber. And they're like, well, how did you know Barbara miscarried? And it's like, oh, I'm not going to tell you guys. And it's like, oh, you just did that as like a way to move the plot along. Okay, that's great.
Exactly.
But they get confirmation that Barbara is at the school, and they kidnap a student named Martin, played by the actor Stan Rice. Now, I didn't put Martin at all in the earlier synopsis, but he does play an important part in the plot, as we'll later get on. I don't want to spoil it quite yet, but he does play an important part in the plot earlier in the film and later in the film. He's the student that I would argue gets fucked up the most. I mean, he is the one that gets physically assaulted in the ice cream parlor. He's also the one that gets physically assaulted in a hardware store where the students later go into town to buy supplies. Yeah. He gets like his leg broken. He has a relationship with Barbara, but he doesn't want to get in a relationship with her because he says that she's ran through and that's not cool. He doesn't fuck with hoes like that. No, he doesn't quite say that, but
basically what he fucking says. It's pretty shitty.
Yeah, he actually literally basically does. He says the 70s version of ran through.
Yeah, he's like, he says she's like a give it girl, or she'll give it up for anyone or something.
Yeah,
and then Billy goes, hey, that has nothing to do with a woman's value. She's allowed to enjoy sex. And then he kicks his ass and breaks his leg.
It's very interesting, but
it's probably my least favorite part of this movie, to be honest. Is like, it's like, well, that sucks. This guy sucks right now.
Yeah. Well, if you think he sucks, in an ensuing chase and gunfight, Bernard and his friend kill Martin, shooting him 4 times in the head. I don't think he deserved to die, but he was a little bit of an asshole. I'll just say that.
He's had kind of retrograde opinions about women's sexuality, but I don't think he should have got shot in the head 4 times by racists.
After all these tragic events, Billy Jack finally gets into gear. He tracks down Bernard, where he finds him raping a 13-year-old. That's not a joke. That literally happens in the movie. Billy Jack walks in on Bernard raping a 13-year-old. They're both naked in bed. Billy Jack is like, how old are you? And the girl says 13, and he's like, get out of here. And you also see a little bit of her nude body. That was a very weird choice. You did not need to put a character who is coded to be a 13-year-old nude in your movie, Tom Laughlin, but whatever.
Do you see? I didn't know you saw any of her nude body, but that's a little strange. I don't know why that's in the film.
I had to just be like, and you do see her front and her butt. It's very...
Oh no.
Very weird. And to be fair, I don't think that actress in real life was 13, but it's still weird. Don't do that. Don't do
that.
And Bernard shoots him in the abdomen, and then Billy Jack, as he's walking towards him, once again with a gunshot wound in his abdomen, he goes up to fucking Bernard and karate chops him in the neck, instantly killing him, which is awesome.
It's awesome. So the central conflict of this film, and actually, the Billy Jack series, is the struggle between Billy Jack's urge to renounce his violent past, his time in Vietnam, and implicitly his time as a roughneck kid before he was in the military, and to be a man of peace and who defends the downtrodden. And the idea, which is not always articulated that well, but is actually, I think, a very significant idea, that violence is all Billy Jack knows. That's how he knows to solve problems. Even though he's thoughtful and he wants to do the right thing. And that should have been a more central conflict to this film, because that's the one with the most juice to me. The idea that Billy Jack is this person who lives a very lonely, solitary life because he's constantly drawn to violence, even as he's trying to outrun it. And, our female protagonist is pretty strongly implied has had an intimate relationship with Billy in the past. Like they have been involved in some capacity. And my read on that relationship is sort of that the reason that years ago they stopped being an item, so to speak, is that Billy Jack is this loner who has violent tendencies and who kind of just sees defending the weak as a thing that you do through force, whereas she's like wants to be an operative of change, specifically nonviolent change. Yes. That is a theme in this movie, and it's my favorite theme in this movie, but it is not given. I don't feel like it's given as much central time. We're not given to wrestle with those ideas as much as we could be, which is too bad. I think that's a really interesting question for an action movie with these kinds of morals.
To be fair, I think, and maybe I'm totally wrong about this because I haven't seen it in quite some time, but I think that's kind of supposed to be the central conceit for First Blood too.
Yeah, it is. That's a good point. I think that's great. First Blood is, I would say, even more tragic in its analysis of that. But you're right. That's a good point. One of the most frustrating things about the Billy Jack movies is that because this is a central theme in struggling to not be violent and to find more positive ways to affect change, a big part of it is that Billy Jack will often not commit violence when he could, and when the audience really wants to, and when he arguably probably should. Like you can respect and appreciate the differences that your like hippie arts and crafts teacher girlfriend has, and still like want to murder rapists. And I don't necessarily think those two things are as at odds as she seems to think when she talks to Billy Jack. When I don't know, it's very frustrating. There's lots of scenes where he's ready to like kill some racists and some bigots and some sexual predators, and then there's this little voice on his shoulder going, "Yeah, but that's not good. You're just being violent." I don't know. It's very frustrating.
And speaking of tragedy, we're getting into the last couple scenes here. Billy Jack makes his way back to the school while authorities have him surrounded. Billy barricades himself in an old church with Barbara. Gene then pleads with him to give himself up and try to give peace a chance, but he refuses. And I believe in this scene, maybe I'm wrong, I could get the timeline wrong, Gene essentially admits to the fact that Bernard and the other guy did rape her. He didn't know, but she basically admits to it.
He doesn't know because she knows, as she knows Billy. It's my read on that. She knows that if he knows, he'll probably kill them, which is not, she's like a tried and true pacifist. That's not what she wants for some reason.
An epic police shootout ensues, and Barbara is wounded in the crossfire. After much pleading from Gene, Billy Jack surrenders to the authorities in exchange for a decade-long guarantee that the school will be allowed to continue to run with Gene as its head. As Billy is driven away in handcuffs, a large crowd of supporters raise their fists as a show of defiance and support as Billy Jack is led to, I assume, the county jail. So, and that's the movie.
So, I love Tom Laughlin. I do. I like his politics. I think he's cool, fascinating figure. I deeply admire him in a lot of ways. At this moment, you could read this scene as Billy Jack in a moment where he's at a crossroads between like radical kind of revolutionary action or like moderate resistance, being swayed into, fighting within this. He agrees to be arrested and go to court and get his day in court so that he can highlight, the social problems that he spent the last two movies fighting with his fist. Is the idea. I have some, I have some opinions on how effective that might be. This film does lead directly into so after Born Losers, the Billy Jack films are basically a trilogy. Tom Laughlin did make this so you're watching the arc of Billy Jack. So after this, we directly go to the trial of Billy Jack. Billy Jack was watching. There's a direct through line there. This is very much, Tom Laughlin is, I would say, and you can even look at, his activism and his, political career, which really was not a practical political career, but sort of performance art, activism, political career. And it does seem like he was a pretty left-leaning Democrat, but ultimately he was a Democrat. And that's pretty well articulated in this scene, in which his badass hero finds that the most badass way to be is not to shoot bad guys, but again, own them with logic in the public marketplace of ideas.
And speaking of the marketplace of ideas, I would like to save my opinions until the very end of this review, because speaking of reviews as well, I wanted to get into some Amazon reviews. Now, Brian, I found some Amazon reviews kind of at the last minute before we started recording, but I can tell you what, I found some phenomenal reviews for this movie because unlike Born Losers, which didn't have a lot of reviews, this movie had a lot of reviews on Amazon. In fact, last time I checked it, I think it has like 3,000 reviews on Amazon.
And that's awesome. I might have to go and read some more because as not my favorite section of the podcast, I hate hearing other people's opinions. That's why I have a podcast so I can say mine, not to hear other people's. No, a lot of people have bad opinions about art and life, and mine are all good. A lot of people on every side of any issue, there's a lot of opinions that I just don't want to hear. And those are, of course, the funniest ones. So we always have them. But I'm so excited to hear reviews about the Billy Jack movies because they're so weird. And I could see 10 different people watching this movie and coming away with completely different things from it. And even picking up and focusing on and thinking it's about, a different scene.
No, 100%. All right, let's get it. So first review here I have is from the user D-Rob, who gives this movie 5 stars.
Drob?
Drob, yeah. And the header of the review says, "Welcome back into my life, Billy Jack. Now, and the body of the review says, I must have watched this movie 100 times while I was growing up. It was one of my absolute favorites. This was before DVDs and VCRs, so if you wanted to see a movie, you had to go to the theater. And I did, over and over again. The movie spoke to my ideals of peace, love, tolerance, and respect for the earth, and I thought the school in the movie was amazing. Once the movie left the theater in my small town, I didn't see it again. In fact, I specifically resisted getting the DVD and watching it because so many of the movies I loved as a kid haven't held up, and I didn't want to ruin my feelings about this one. Then someone posted a YouTube video of One Tin Soldier, and watching it made me want to see the movie again. Finally, after 45 years, I needn't have worried. Billy Jack is just as wonderful now as it was then. From my perspective, now as an upper middle-aged woman, the ideals of peace, love, tolerance, and respect for the earth are just as timely and even more meaningful today than they were back in the 70s.
Liz Warren write this review? She's like, I'm also a half-breed, so I really identified with this movie.
My husband had never seen the movie before, and he watched it with me. I was afraid he would think it was hokey and wouldn't understand how it meant so much to me. Again, I needn't have worried. Its ideals resonated with him just as much as they did with me. The teenage me and the middle-aged me. So welcome back into my life, Billy Jack.
Hit me up. Hit me up. We'll watch Billy Jack together. Come on, Dump to Zero. Get with Billy Jack.
I think the world needs you now more than ever, and I agree. Return of Billy Jack.
Yeah,
Let's bring Tom Laughlin back from the dead real quick. But
review. I like this dumb chick.
If you really love that review, you'll fucking love this one. So next review here is from the user unregistered username who gives this movie 1 star. And the header of the review says, phony pandering hippie drivel. And the body and the body of the review says, like many children in the 70s, I was fascinated by this yarn in the day. I saw it several times and dutifully saw Born Losers, and parentheses, a exploitation re-release that features Billy Jack's character and a far better film. I disagree. I think this movie's way better than Born Losers. I'm just gonna put that.
Who's this fucking guy? Or lady?
As well as The Trial of Billy Jack, in parentheses, the third installment, and even worse than this outing, years later.
Yes.
It's enlightening to realize that we have outgrown from our youth. The acting, directing, and production is pretty awful, but forgivable. The ideology spouted in this stinker is a fast food bastardization of the worst hold hands and sing together hippie trash. Tom Laughlin plays the title role of former Green Beret and reclusive, quote-unquote, half-breed, in parentheses, their words, protector of a Southwestern freedom school, where love interest / head school marm Jean, played by Dolores Taylor, and her dotish charges harbor runaways, perform dreadful improv and guerrilla theater, and generally get under the skin of redneck cowboy law enforcement in their town. When Jean protects the runaway daughter of a local lawman, tensions come to a head, and Billy Jack must step away from the pacifism he and Jean cherish and lay gratuitous kung fu beatdowns on local bullies. For martial arts fans, the payoff are far and few. If you enjoy rape scenes, in parentheses, and I sure hope you do not, there are a couple of man with knife holding bad things to women scenes that appear as salacious panders to this element. If watching
they're salacious scenes, Taylor. Like I don't read them as that. They don't.
No, I don't agree with that either. They're pretty. They're not very. Yeah, they're very unpleasant to watch. They don't make them very titillating. I'll just say that.
Okay, thank you. Agreed.
If watching the Freedom School kids travel around like a Marxist Partridge Family in their stupid hippie bus doesn't make you dread Flower Child nostalgia, you will surely be disgusted by the use of violence to market nonviolence. The lecturing moral high ground of the film's message and the all-around insipid style of the useless artifact. Note, all martial arts in the film are performed by Laughlin stand-in, the great master Bong Soo-han. And if you look closely, you'll notice a distinct physical dissimilarity between Laughlin and the man doing roundhouse
man.
So that is the review. And Brian, do you love this person?
What's his name or her name?
Unregistered username.
Because you can't publicly say an opinion like that without getting torn apart. Because the masses love Billy Jack, and they're not going to stand for this. Okay, here's what I'm going to say about this, for real. It's silly, kind of confused, passing antibiotics, but maybe I'm theme to this. I really read as a theme into this the conflict with Billy Jack being like his desire to be violent versus like his ideals to like give up violence. That to me is like the central conflict for him as a character. Maybe I'm being too. This guy's an asshole. These are fun movies. They're good. Tom Laughlin was trying to put forward a positive worldview, and he was very. I don't think he was pandering. By the way, I feel like it was. These are pretty taking a pretty big risk making this movie at the time.
That's the thing I will say about Tom Laughlin. Everything he did was earnest as fuck.
Yeah, and you could there's things to criticize about that. There's certainly fucking ham-fisted and goofy things in here, but I do not think he was pandering. At least, I mean, it's been a while since I watched the other films of his, but I don't know. I just don't like this guy. I also don't think I would not call those scenes salacious. I wouldn't say that this movie should have a big old content warning on them, but there's not, I mean, they're not sexualized scenes. They're meant to, you should be identifying with the victims in those scenes. They're very much shot and presented that way.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
I take strong issue with that.
I do too, 100%. This reviewer can go fuck themselves. When I saw the review on Amazon, I'm like, I have to put this in here because I know this will make us both mad. Like, I have to do it.
Glad you did. Oh, wow. Anonymous user.
All right. Next review I have here is from Gary F. Taylor, who gives this movie 2 stars. And the head of the review says, awesomely pretentious. And the body of the review says, I was 12 years old when I saw this on the big screen and loved every minute of it. Today, I feel a trickle of cold sweat whenever the name is mentioned. It isn't so much that Billy Jack is a bad movie as it is an awesomely pretentious one rife with hypocrisy. The story of non-violent Native Americans and flower children saved from hysterical cowboys by Billy Jack, in parentheses, who wants to be non-violent but always has to kick butt, is well-intentioned, but from a modern standpoint, it is more than just a little embarrassing. The production values are so-so, and the cast is merely adequate at best. If you have fond memories of this film, keep them by leaving Billy Jack in the past. Don't see it again. And if you have never seen it, well, leave well enough alone. I also disagree with this person. Very vehement.
Couple things. Pretentious. There are things to criticize Laughlin's filmmaking and the Billy Jack series for. There sure are. And I don't think we've shied away from them. I don't think he's pretentious. I think these are very populist. They're almost like fairy tales.
Yeah, he's like a very, definitely not pretentious. I would describe him as like just a very working class type of individual.
I don't understand why all these people have the concept of like, oh, the movies are about pacifism, but the character isn't always a pacifist? Like, they can't understand that, like, Billy Jack is not an actual person. I don't understand all of these people saying pretty hypocritical of the film to have a message of anti-violence, but then have a protagonist that's always hurting people, as if they can't connect that this is a movie and that Billy Jack is not a real person that exists, and that also it'd be a pretty boring movie if there were no fights. And it's not like they were saying that pacifism was the answer and then going and like killing people. I mean, I don't know. Pretty disingenuous fucking. It sounds very smug and Gen X to me. Like, oh, this is actually pretty hypocritical because it's not all broken down like a coloring book for me.
It's kind of one of those things where it's like that meme where it's like we should change society somewhat, and it's like, well, but you participate in society.
That's almost literally what it was. In fact, if there were have I told you about my idea for a Billy Jack reboot? Okay, well, in a future episode, maybe we'll get into that because that's the thing I think about a lot. Anyways, bad review, bad person, good film.
And speaking of good film, good review, and good people, we're on to the very last review that I highlighted here. The user SJ Folk gives this film 5 stars. And the header of the review says, because it's in all caps, Billy Jack, bullies behave or get a whack. And that's the header of the review says.
I'm going to write a song with that. I'm going to credit this guy. I'm going to credit SJ Folk for that.
Yeah, Billy Jack creator, the charismatic Tom Laughlin, was a true-life American hero. Writer, actor, director, and activist Tom and his wife Dolores Taylor devoted their lives to championing the cause of Native Americans. Tom also broke new ground in the movie industry. Thanks to his persistent vision and innovative marketing insight, independent film producers today have an easier job of distributing their movies. I got a kick hearing how Tom fell in love with that black hat. Seems a friend had found it somewhere and was going to throw it out, but Tom saw it and rescued it. He knew it was perfect for Billy Jack. That kind of intuitive awareness is typical of genius, knowing instinctively what fits and what doesn't. And the Billy Jack movie fits right into the rarefied rank of all-time great American motion pictures. You'll enjoy the original and its sequels.
So I agree with this review, but I want to say that I don't actually think that these are like great American films. They're very American, and I love them, and I think they're good for what they are. But if I'm being objective, these are not great films. That these are films that I think there's two types of people who watch Billy Jack. Mostly, I think there's people who are going to have like myself who have a really strong response to it, and a couple of these reviewers like a very strong emotional response to it. And then there's probably a lot of people, especially if you're younger than someone, who are like, "Well, what is this?" Because the films are a mess. I totally agree with this review, but I think that's me looking at it through those emotions. Like, I think there's a type of person that has a very because they maybe there's a strong desire to have more people like Billy Jack, more like men who are tough and manly and thoughtful and sensitive in America who, can kind of get their hands dirty for good things. Like, that's the thing that I think. I mean, I know since I was a little kid, I've always wished that there were more people in real life like that. So I tend to respond to characters like that in media. But I don't think it's because they're like these great films. They're not like, it's not like watching like a Tarantino film or something that's just so well crafted. But I think if you're someone that identifies, with Laughlin and kind of what he was trying to do, you'll probably like these movies like I do. And like, I think that reviewer and the previous one did, but they're not like great.
I will say that was the last review that we have here. And I would like to get into my thoughts as well for this film. So I would agree. I don't think these are great American films, but I would say these are important American films. Just objectively speaking, they are very important for the historical context of films and filmmaking that we see today. That's like just an objective fact. This movie being, once again, as I mentioned before, the highest grossing independent film of all time until Paranormal Activity almost 5 decades later should tell you how important this movie was in regards to really pioneering independent film as an actual popular and creative outlet for millions or thousands and maybe even millions of creators and directors and producers and actors. Like, honestly, without Tom Laughlin, we might not have people like, Kevin Smith or Tarantino today. We just might not.
Yeah, I mean, we've already on the Tarantino. Of course, these films are loaded with things that Tarantino loves. He loves creepy villains who are threatening to women. He loves martial arts. He loves ham-fisted, justice-bound good guys.
And I will say, too, I really liked this movie a lot. I do have some issues with it. Primarily, I think there's too much filler. I think this movie definitely needed to be cut. And to be fair, from what I've seen, because both the trial of Billy Jack and Billy Jack Goes to Washington because isn't the trial almost 3 hours long?
A long movie. Yeah, it's a big boy.
Insane. I'm sorry, insane. And at 113 and 114 minutes, both Born Losers and Billy Jack, respectively, are just too long. They're just too long. They needed to be cut. There are some scenes that just didn't need to be there. And also, I loved the action scenes in this movie. They're my favorite parts of the movie. They're not the only good parts of this movie, but they're my favorite parts. There needed to be more action. There needed to be less filler. And if this movie was like a solid 95 minutes with just like 2 or 3 more action scenes, this would be a 10 out of 10 movie for me. I'm not joking.
Same. And I feel like, sorry not to, I feel like not even necessarily that these need to be much shorter, but you could replace some of those filler scenes. Like, so what Laughlin is really interested in, I feel like, is the verbal sparring and all the debate things. And, talking about these social issues in a public forum. I've said that about 10 times because it's so important to drive through that these are a very weird type of action movie. But you have a series of those, and then you spice them up with a few more fucking kung fu scenes, just because why wouldn't you? It fucking looks cool.
Having debate and philosophy in action films has been around forever. Like they have done it. They have done it well in other movies. Like Tom Laughlin, you can kick more people's asses in your movies. Like
yeah. Yeah, that's why I'm wondering. It's like, did he not have time to, or did he not, or was he uncomfortable? Maybe he was aware of the apparent contradiction. I don't really see the contradiction in having fictional violence in a film with an anti-violence message. I don't really understand that. But maybe Laughlin himself thought that, and so maybe limited it. I don't know.
I have a little bit of a theory. So I think it goes back to my other little pet theory about Tom Laughlin. Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, because I would have to look at some of the promotional materials, but the promotional materials made this seem to be much more of like a sort of grindhouse cinema classic.
Yeah.
And I think Tom Laughlin believed in the way that a lot of political propagandists have stated, for better or worse, that you use film as a way to spread your message. And what he was really good at, and two things he was really good at. One was portraying his very limited action skills in a movie that were badass, and also spreading a message in a movie. He wanted to probably get people in the door, and very clearly he did, because I said a lot of these reviews here were people who saw this movie when they were like young teenagers or even preteens, because they wanted to see kick-ass violence, and then they were shown a message. I think he got people in the door with the action, and they stayed for the message. I think that was his idea.
I agree. Do you think... I don't think having more of the violence, the fictional violence, would have undercut the message necessarily either, though.
I don't agree with that at all. Billy Jack is not the instigator of violence. He is never the instigator. He is always doing it as a way to defend others. Always. It is defensive. It is not, he's not initiating the violence.
He doesn't, and it does seem like he kind of enjoys fighting because that's just a cool guy in a movie. But yeah, that's the other thing about people pointing out the hip hop. Going back to the reviews, I'm sorry, but because I've also heard that in other reviews when I do research for these movies. There's always people saying that. People think they're so fucking clever, and I don't understand. It's like, well, it's just a movie. He's not actually like breaking people's necks doing dropkick time. It's fake.
And they even address it, and we didn't get into this in the review, but they do even mention it in the movie that, like, even if you are a pacifist, defending yourself from an immediate perceived threat, you can still be a pacifist and defend yourself from an immediate threat.
Well, and like I said, I think, well, of course, you have to, or else you fucking die in the world. But also, I do feel like that's the central arc of Billy Jack, is that he wants to be a pacifist, but he keeps getting pulled into violence or maybe drawn to it. I do think that's a conscious artistic choice of Laughlin. I think, anyways. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I will say, I do want to reiterate, I really liked this movie a lot. I did, just like with Born Losers, I did not necessarily skip the filler scenes, but I did fast forward them just a little bit. But other than that, I enjoyed every other scene in this movie very distinctly. They all had something interesting to show. They had all something interesting to say, even though the tone of this movie is pretty wildly disparate. One scene will be an action scene, the other will be a rape scene, just putting that out there.
Then there is a literal, between a martial arts action scene and the rape scene, there is an improv comedy section. That is not a joke.
There is also which to be fair, they would later do that. Wes Craven and Sean Cunningham would later do that in Last House on the Left. So.
Oh yeah, boy, I don't skip that enough. But boy, that is wild how they pull that one off, huh?
That's the thing. We were talking about Tom Laughlin's influence. Without Billy Jack and Tom Laughlin, we might have also not had the slasher movie boom of the 80s either, to be honest.
It might not have been, because this is paving the way for a pathway to mainstream acceptance for a weird independent film. It was probably going to happen eventually, but it might not have happened the way that it did if not for Laughlin and Billy Jack.
There is a lot of very disparate scenes in this movie that just narratively do not work in. They're very weird. This movie is a very strange movie. It is an enjoyable movie. I do like it. If seeing pretty harmful depictions of rape and sexual assault in a movie is not something you want to see, I understand. It is more impactful and respectful than Born Losers, but I will say to the audience at home, still obviously trigger warning to that.
For real, a legit content warning on that. Yeah, of course.
But I will say once again, I loved this movie. I did like it more than Born Losers, but I do think, you're right, as you mentioned earlier, Born Losers was very much a product that Tom Laughlin was using as a proof of concept for Billy Jack. It was a pre-Hays Code, it was a pre-MPAA rating system where the Hays Code was still technically in effect. So he was much more limited. He had a much, as we mentioned in the review, he had a much lower budget. In fact, most of the budget had to be financed by API, the film company that he was using. But this movie had a much higher budget. It was post-Hays. He had the ability to just go all in. And for better or worse, I think he did a damn good job.
Yeah, and I will say, of the Billy Jack films, I would say this is the most approachable. It's the one that makes the best use of its time. I don't think any Billy Jack films are particularly accessible to a modern viewer, to be honest. If I'm being completely honest, I don't think any of these movies are necessarily just a thing you could just show to a wide audience, especially in 2023, and have a lot of people, or a majority.
You wouldn't,
if I'm being honest.
Yeah, you wouldn't have like a girl over for the first date and be like, "Hey, Netflix and chill," and you put on Born Losers. That's not gonna happen.
Yeah, no. I mean, no. It's just for a multitude of reasons.
It's like, "Hey, baby, let's put on a movie for background noise," and you put on the Trial of Billy Jack, a nearly 3-hour long movie.
That is literally a big extended court scene.
It's like, "Oh, so yeah, baby, you like that?" And then you just hear them arguing in court in the background.
The Trial of Billy Jack is in some ways my favorite in the series.
Which is interesting because from the little research I had found, it was a pretty big critical flop.
Well, it exploded and it's big and it's really like, so there's a lot of, I'm going to tell you something, Taylor. There's a lot of Billy Jack lore. It's a lore heavy Billy Jack film. Any questions that this film or Born Losers might have raised in his head? Well, they're probably not answered. But a lot of questions that you never thought of about Billy Jack might be answered. It's Laughlin at his most, like, this is it. Billy Jack, trial, Washington, they lead directly into it. So Billy Jack's been arrested. Basically, he kind of just, like, on paper, he kidnapped a woman and went on a shooting spree and had a standoff with the cops. And now he's facing trial. And this is going to be a trial that Lee Harvey Oswald, he made it there, style, is going to use as a political platform to get the world on his side. And it's out of control. It's so Laughlin, just crazy, so determined in getting his message out. Did we talk at all about the unfinished Billy Jack film?
We have not, but I would really like to save that for future Billy Jack episodes. I'm very interested in hearing that. We'll save that. One thing I'm going to continue looking for. I've been looking for a long time for a book length, a biography of Laughlin. Doesn't seem to be that I can find. I look all the time. I look at bookstores. I check online to see if there maybe one will pop up that I've just missed. But there isn't really one that I can find. If anyone can recommend me, and I'm going to continue looking, because I would really like for these episodes to have a book, like a good book about Tom Laughlin. Please, anyone listening, let me know. I'm really proud of these episodes because, again, there isn't a lot of discussion about Billy Jack online. Most of what is there is pretty facile, and it's it's by boomers, which is good because it's their film, it's their era. But it's kind of just nostalgia. It's, oh, you remember Billy Jack? What a quirky 70s trip that was. And that's about it. If you're looking for a book about Tom Laughlin, you can always look up the 1949 Washington High School of Milwaukee yearbook, because he is definitely in there. I mean, that's a good start. And it's also got Gene Wilder in it, of course. I believe I mentioned that to you. That's so cool. Aw. And so was Laughlin, was he from Wisconsin? No, yeah, he was born and raised in Milwaukee. He graduated from Washington High School. He was raised on the north side of Milwaukee, I believe in Sherman Park. God love him. And in the same neighborhood where Gene Wilder lived. In fact, Gene Wilder, I think, was only 2 years younger than him, so they went to high school at the same time. He is from Wisconsin. Like, it's just like boy, that makes me happy. This will not be our last Billy Jack episode. Please. I mean, I don't normally do it. I'm very happy that we're talking about this. If anyone listening, when you have any insights, any thoughts, any feedback, anything at all, I love talking about these movies, and I love knowing that people are talking about these movies, because I truly think a lot of movies get called underappreciated, and these are underappreciated films. They're almost like lost classics at this point, and how little generations after the boomers are aware of or talk about them. And that kind of bums me out. So before we sign off, Brian, is there any final thoughts? No, I think I've pretty much gotten into it. Like I said, there will be more Billy Jack in Mao's future, because of course,
Tom Laughlin was a Marxist, just like Mao. But these are weird films. I would really encourage anyone who loves strange films or 70s films or whatever to watch them. But I'm not promising that anyone listening will like them because they're not for everyone.
100%. And I will definitely agree too. As I mentioned earlier, as a part of a bit, if you're doing Netflix and chill with your girlfriend, do not watch these movies for that. But if you're looking for a interesting film in the history of modern cinema, definitely Born Losers and the first Billy Jack movie are great movies to watch for that context because, once again, Born Losers was pre-New Hollywood, but I would say arguably proto-New Hollywood. And Billy Jack is very much of a new Hollywood. This is a new era of filmmaking. And for better or worse, it's an incredibly influential film.
If you're only going to watch one, it should be Billy Jack. In fact, you may as well watch Billy Jack. And if you are interested after that, watch Born Losers. Billy Jack's the essential one. Of the 4 films, it's the only one that I would say is essential, unless you're like a fan.
All right, so this is going to be Taylor signing off here. You can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com.
This is Brian signing off. You can follow me at johnstab at Twitter.com. That's JONSTABB. Talk with me about Billy Jack. I tweet about him a lot.
All right, have a good night, everybody.